Turn to your program now at 8, on page 8, and you can see we're going to kick right into the program. And with that, I'm going to introduce Troy Appelhans, who is starting his 20th year with CattleFax. And I'm a proud member of CattleFax. And if you'll turn over to page 12 in your program, at the bottom of page 12 there, you can read a full bio and that whole list there about our speakers. Troy Appelhans has a rich history in the cattle business, and I am a proud member of CattleFax and encourage you to do the same, because they provide amazing analysis and predictions and forecasts and educational programs for members to help us improve our bottom line. And that's improved profits, what we're going to talk about today, and reduce costs. All of that accounts to the bottom line. So Troy, if you'll come up, he's a cow-calf stocker market analyst representing the Southern Plains. Please welcome Troy Appelhans with CattleFax.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's great to see all of you here. And Andy, as always, it's a pleasure for us to be invited back. It's a pleasure on behalf of CattleFax to be invited to speak at this great event. But the theme is all about the numbers this year. And quite frankly, one of the reasons why these cattle prices are going to do what they are going to do over the next several years is because these numbers are low. And so we talk about the cattle cycle, and that is what the main thing that is in here with regards to historically. This goes back to the early 1800s, folks. The early 1800s is how long these cattle cycles have been in existence as we've looked at the data. Historically, this is the way they perform. There's a little bit of odds and ends every now and then, but essentially every 10 to 12 years, there is a cattle cycle. And as you can see, these prices will tend to go up. We're just in the beginning stages of this, folks. This is one of the things that I think is so encouraging, and let's call it what it is. I mean, those of you that are in drought, which consists of most of you in this room, you don't get to participate near to the levels that you would like to in these up markets. That's unfortunate, but that's obviously the way these cattle cycles work as well. You don't get to build and gain that equity position that you need to due to the reduced numbers that you're having to run. Obviously, we are not anywhere close to expansion at this point. My thought process is Mother Nature is going to drive when expansion occurs. But I think it's going to be a slower, more methodical type of an expansion to where we can see these higher prices last longer into the middle of this decade and beyond, into the latter part of this decade for sure. When we look at this in terms of cattle inventory and beef production, we can see that we're able to do more with less. We know that when we look back, and there was from 2014 to 18, when we went through the rapid expansion, remember the years of 2014 and 15 when prices got so good, we've already surpassed those levels on the fed cattle market. We sold fed cattle for an average of about 178 a couple weeks ago. Now the feeder cattle and calf markets have yet to reach those highest levels in history, and that's simply because of the drought and these increased feed costs have held those back. But we're able to do more with less. We look at the last expansion time period from 2014 to 18 when we peaked cow numbers in 2019. As of presently, we're 5.5 million fewer cattle total out here in the country. Now, what drives these cattle cycles? It's either environmentally driven or economically driven. One or two or both of those have to be occurring at all times for these cattle cycles to work. We know that we tend to have these 10, 11, 12-year cycles with regard to weather, but this cattle cycle is largely being driven by a lack of both of these. There hasn't been tremendous profitability in this business, particularly at the cow-calf sector. We'll talk about leverage between the segments as we go through this presentation today. But that is one of the biggest things and the biggest factor that has changed and why cattle producers down to the cow-calf level will be in the driver's seat going forward. Just simply because the factory has gotten so small. This is obviously, that's a pretty sound, isn't it? I don't think anybody's going to complain about that. Hopefully that sound drowns me out a little bit here. Funny that this slide should come up right at that time. Folks, this has been a major headwind. Major headwind. We've got the second worst drought in 40 years. Those of you that have been in business in 2011 and 12 remember that time frame as well, correct? We're in the same. We've got over 50% of the cows herd in the country that have been in some form of drought. That's why we've had such major reductions in the cow herd up to this point, and as a result, why these prices will get better going forward. Now, I'm not trying to take Brian Bledsoe's theme here, but I have to lay this out. The weather patterns are changing, right? We just look from November 1st until the most recent drought monitor that I have pulled up here. Things are better around most of the country. Unfortunately, you look at Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, there's a lot of cows in that part of the world, isn't there? And unfortunately, that remains in fairly severe drought. It's going to change for us going forward. When we look at the Climate Prediction Center, you can see at the bottom there's very low blue lines. What this is telling us is that the La Nina weather pattern is non-existent. The ocean temperatures are changing along the equator where they're warming. This is an indicator that we are going into an El Nino or a wetter weather pattern going forward. The ocean temperatures have changed, but it hasn't reached the land part of it yet. But going forward, as this data would show, that as we get later, deeper into the summer, into the fall, the probabilities of an El Nino or wetter weather pattern are certainly there. Now, obviously, in a lot of cases, we need rain right now to grow some grass. So in a lot of cases, that's going to be too late for many of us. But God deals us what he wants when he wants. I do think that we're going to get some relief with regards to the feedstuffs. When we look at the weather patterns changing, when we look at the number of acres that are intended to be planting with regards to corn, we know how high corn and feed costs have been. These feed yards in the Texas Panhandle have obviously been paying about $2 a bushel over the spot corn price for the majority of last fall and this winter and early spring. These costs of gains are very high. And when costs of gains are high, what does that result in? It means your cattle that you're trying to sell are worth less money as costs of gains are high. I do think that we're going to get some relief from that. When we look at the hay stocks, we look at December 1 hay stocks were the lowest since 1954. Put that into context. The lowest December 1 hay stocks since 1954, and 2022 hay production was the lowest since 1959. I don't think I have to tell anybody in this room how high hay prices have gotten. Obviously, all of these hay prices have gotten. They went up largely in 2021. They're high in 2022. When we look at Texas specifically, and this is all hay, we look at it as near $200 a ton. We see the big spike that happened last year in about July when we started having these flash droughts, particularly in the southern plains. This is one of the reasons why that hay prices have gone up, but I think you can also include in that the inclusion or more dairies in Texas that have increased the price of hay as well, particularly on the alfalfa side. Let's talk about herd liquidation and supply reductions. We look at beef cow slaughter. Look at the comments over here on the top right. The culling rate of 13.4%, the highest since 1957. A lot of this data is going back to the 50s. It's going back a long time, isn't it? A tremendously long time ago when we look at this. We see how beef cow slaughter was so elevated back there in 2022. We look at it year to date, we're down 10%, but we're just now along the 5-year average currently. We're still in liquidation mode, folks. Not anywhere close to expanding. We look at the beef replacement heifers. The past 2 years, they've been down over 300,000 head. We look at the heifers as a percent of placements in feed yards, heifers as a percentage of the federally inspected slaughter, heifers as a percentage of the overall auction receipts. None of this would indicate that we're even close to expansion yet. I think that's good news for all of you. And the reason being is because you're not able to capitalize on the higher market prices that we're seeing right now simply due to the erosion of numbers that you've seen. But I think these prices are going to last for a while. You're going to get an opportunity to participate at some point down the road. We look at commercial beef cow slaughter. That's a pretty big number that we're forecasting it to be down this year, down 750,000 head. But you look at that across the board, it's still pretty historically high. We're still in liquidation mode, folks. When we look at the inventory, I mentioned that in 2019 was the last cycle peak that we saw peak beef cow numbers at 31.7 million head. Presently, we are 2.8 million fewer beef cows in the United States than we were just in 2019. This is indicative of higher prices to come. We look at the beef cow inventory by region, and you see the red line. Obviously, that's the one that has the most. That'd be the Southern Plains. And this is since 2014. And I go back to 2014 because that was the last low in cycle numbers, in terms of cow numbers. Where we've seen the big reductions is in the Northern Plains, the Southern Plains, and the Southeast, major cow-calf areas. When we look at just since 2019, since the peak, this looks a little more drastic. When we back up here, you can see that the Southern Plains still has more beef cows than they did in 2014. But look at since 2019 how the Northern and Southern Plains have deteriorated in terms of cow numbers. Now, folks, a lot of these people aren't coming back. We know what the age of the producer is. We know that in certain cases they're just tired of fighting it. We need to keep the beef cow industry strong, and the way we do that is through profitability. Quite frankly, producers haven't made enough money to keep this a viable industry. We know that as we look towards future generations and see, do you want to come back and do this? Do you want to be in the beef cow industry? The answer is simply a no in a lot of cases. That's unfortunate. We need to get some more profitability in this business, and I think we're going to get that going forward. We look at just steer. I mentioned that beef cow slaughter was going to be down 750,000 head. Look at fed cattle slaughter, down about 700,000 head for the year. Not only do we have fewer numbers, we're producing less beef. We feel like that we're going to produce about 4 pounds or 4% fewer beef throughout the year when we start including fed cattle slaughter as well as fewer cow slaughter into the mix. 4% reduction in beef cow slaughter or in beef production this year. We look at carcass weights. I think this year's a little too high. Obviously, we've had major weather concerns in the northern feeding regions that has impacted the weights of fed cattle. So we look at weights, we look at numbers, all of these things to look at beef production. And we look at beef imports and exports, and quite frankly, we're going to be around 3.5 billion pounds. Last year, we exported 3% higher. This year, we're expecting 3% lower. We're going to get more imports. Folks, when we look at the reduction of beef cow slaughter and we take into account that 50% of overall beef consumption in the United States is in the form of ground beef, we're going to import more product. And it's simply a demand issue. I know there's a lot of people worry about the import structure of this industry, but it's simply to fill the demand. This is an important slide because I want you to see and notice a 2.3 pound reduction in per capita supply. When we look at production, this is an important number because based on constant demand, which is never there always, it's always fluctuating some, but based on constant demand, a 1 pound change in per capita supply is worth $10 a hundredweight to the fed cattle market. $10. So 2.3 pound reduction in essence, based on constant demand, should be worth $23 a hundredweight to the fed cattle market. Now, we look, why is $23 a hundredweight to the fed cattle market important to you? If cattle feeders are profitable, you as a feeder cattle or a calf seller are more profitable as well. The leverage shift is starting to occur. When we look at what the competing meats, because people ask me, what is the biggest concern you have during this cattle cycle presently that could impact or sway or not let this market reach its full potential? Well, obviously demand is a big one. The economy the way it is, not just domestically, but the global economy could go into a global recession. Remember 2008, 9, 10, during the global financial crisis. We're worried about that again. It's not that it's top mind concern, but it's there. It's always in the back of our mind. We always kind of seem to have these black swan type of events that limits the market from its pure ability to advance to the levels that we think it should. So we look at the competing meats because beef is obviously the most vulnerable because it's the highest price protein out of the three. So when times get tough, we look at the competing meats and say, well, are we doing demand destruction? Is a consumer going to trade down to a cheaper protein source? At this point, we're very competitive. But we have to talk about the inflation, the recession, and how that will impact beef demand going forward. This isn't something new, folks. I mean, we look at the inflation rate. We're at 5%, but you obviously look at that. We're comparing against a year ago, right? It was really high a year ago. Interest rates are advancing significantly. 7.5% interest rates, 7.75% interest rates on these operating lines of credit and so forth. When you look at the accumulated interest cost, if you were a cow-calf operator and you were retaining ownership of your cattle all the way through a feed yard, this is kind of what you could look at in terms of the additional interest costs you're going to pay on the money you have to borrow. Now, there are some assumptions in this, particularly on the cow-calf side. This is simply looking at an operating line of credit, the additional interest that you would pay based on simply the cow cost, the cash cow costs. If you look at this from the stocker side, this is based on 20% equity in the cattle, and you're paying interest on all of the land that you're leasing. From the fed cattle side, we would look at this at 20% equity, but you're paying interest on the cattle, the remainder of the cattle, and all the feed. That cost is basically doubled. Remember we went through so many years where interest rates were 3.5%, 4%? We also have to look at per capita disposable income. This is adjusted for inflation. How much money does a consumer have to spend on the product? Well, it's gone up a little bit, but you can see that we were back towards levels that we were in 2018. Disposable income is simply income after taxes, okay? So this is what the U.S. per capita disposable income is, and we want to know if they can afford our product going forward. That is important to us based on demand. One of the major things that we feel very confident about is the fact that unemployment is so low. This is different than we were in 2008, 9, 10 during the global financial crisis when we had unemployment rates that were 7.5%, 8%. Now we have unemployment rates that are about 3.5%. We look at 10 million open positions in January and 5 million people looking for work. Now we look at this and you look at this from the standpoint of the baby boomer generation. A lot of those are exiting the workforce. Quite frankly, there's a lot of people that should be in the workforce that have simply stopped looking for work. But I don't think that demand is going to get impacted on the beef side as bad as it did certainly during the global financial crisis, simply because we have more people that are working. We look at fresh retail beef prices and how we compete. You can see that the bulk of beef inflation occurred in 2021. In 2022, it's been pretty flat. We look at the competing proteins, and we want to know how do we compete with the protein sources. And the main ones to look at on here are ground beef, a boneless pork chop or the pork cutout, as well as a boneless chicken breast. And so far, so good how we compete with them, right? This is at retail. Now, there's plenty of margin for the retail side on the pork and the poultry side at the present time. Therefore, beef is getting less featuring activity. And so we have to watch that going forward to see how beef is competitively priced with our competing meats. Now, I want you to realize that from 1980 to 1998, we cut beef demand in half. This is where I'm going to challenge each and every one of you. Because going through this cattle cycle, when these prices finally do peak and start to come down, we're going to have too many cattle around. That's why prices are going to start coming down. What is the main thing that you need to focus on going forward is quality. Good cattle will always sell even in a downtrending market. They will always sell well. And that's something that as we go into this expansion phase that we're inevitably going through over the next 2 to 3 years, the quality, breeding true replacement quality heifers, not just heifers, is what's probably going to keep us in business and keep the consumer coming back to the protein of choice. When we cut beef demand in half from 1980 to 1998, it was because we had an inferior product. We had 40% of the cattle that were grading choice. 1 out of 3 eating experiences for the consumer was unsatisfactory. Those of you remember that was going on during that time frame? We certainly had the influx of the European breeds during the 70s. Remember those show cattle pictures back in the 80s? Cattle were up here, couldn't even see the people behind them in the backdrops. Those of you who've seen those can remember that it was all about lean beef, right? That wasn't a very satisfying eating experience for the consumer. As we look at it today, we've got the highest beef demand that we've had in over 30 years. When we look at this, we look at the price of retail beef, wholesale beef, and fed cattle that has outpaced inflation up to this point. That's a sign of much better beef demand. It's a testament to you as cattle producers that you're producing the right kind of cattle. You're focusing on what's right, and that's ultimately the consumer. Beef demand is very high today, but we've got some weaker demand. Remember I told you about that 2.3 pounds per capita supply down is worth $23 to the fed market? We've got some weaker demand factored into this. We're not going to get all of that $23. So when we look at this in terms of the prime and choice grading percentage, look at how much improvement we've done over time. From 2005 to 2022, we've increased prime production 2.5 to 10%. Folks, prime is the new choice. Remember when everything we were doing, we were trying to produce choice cattle? Now we're trying to produce prime. And the ultimate goal of the consumer or the packer or whatever you want to look at today is if we could produce a prime yield grade 3, that is the ultimate type of cattle that the consumer is wanting today. We'll get there. We'll get there. This is why you need to focus and continue to focus on quality. And I realize that you can't single trait select for just carcass merit. But when we look back at this, choice beef demand has grown 60% from the demand lows in 1998. And look at what the demand for select has done. We've produced less select quite a bit and haven't been able to raise the price when adjusted for inflation. You look at this in terms of the prime price, the prime choice spread, or the choice select spread, the money is where the quality is. We look at the carcasses and what producers are getting paid for today. When we look at the negotiated cash, the premiums versus the negotiated cash, these cattle that are grading over 80% choice, they've got an additional $50 bill tacked on to them. The market is doing its job by decreasing the premiums or actually penalizing those cattle that are non-performers. Going forward, this is going to continue to be your goal as a producer, is to produce the right quality stuff for what the consumer wants. I want to get into the prices and profitability here, and we have to start somewhere in terms of the consumer. And so we look at the composite cutout. We feel like that we're going to be somewhere around 280 this year in terms of the composite cutout. Average has been 4.2% from 2000 to 2019. Obviously, when we look at it over the past couple of years, it's been about 6%. This is very good, indicative of a very good demand for our product. We're getting the leverage situation figured out, because this is ultimately what has been the downfall or the non-profitability to the industry that we've seen, is that the packer had all of the margin. They were making obscene profits for a number of years. That leverage shift started in 2016, and we really just got through the backup of cattle that we saw, the disruptions that we saw in 2019 when we had the plant fire in Kansas, a 6,000 head per day plant. Obviously, the pandemic disruptions that we saw in 2000, more pandemic disruptions in 21 and early 22. Folks, we backed up 1 million head of cattle during that time frame, and we just got through them. We just got through them. But we're aligning ourselves where we're getting the shackle space more in line with what the cattle supply is, and that in turn will transfer the leverage back to you as cattle producers. This is a leverage shift that I talk about. We're just talking about fed cattle price as a percent of the composite cutout, okay? Look in 2016 how that leverage shift began and how low it got in 2021. We're getting that back. We're getting the leverage back, and that's really, really important. So, getting into the price outlook that we look at, we feel like that for fed cattle, we're going to average somewhere around 164. That range is somewhere from 155, which is the first couple of weeks of this year when that happened. We're close to 180 a couple of weeks ago on fed cattle. Feel like that we can get towards that level as we get out there into the fall. It's been a really impulsive move on the fed cattle price, hasn't it, the past several weeks? I think a lot of this is indicative of the fact that we went through some very severe weather, particularly in the northern feeding regions in Nebraska and Colorado this winter, and it's very indicative of a weather-type market year that we've seen. You can see in these non-expansion years and even these 20-year index that you typically will make a higher high in the fed cattle market out there in the fall than you do in the first half of the year. We're expecting that to occur this year. We look at the feeder cattle and calf supply, down over 700,000 head to start the year. We know that we had somewhat of a bearish cattle on feed report last Friday where the placements exceeded expectations. Expectations were about 95% and placements come in about 99%. When you have this type of a decline to start the year, more placements now means fewer to place later, right? I think this feeder cattle market is going to get very explosive going into the second half of the year. For those of you that have feeder cattle to sell during the second half of the year, it is going to get pretty good. When we look at this is our feeder cattle prices and our estimate. We're expecting an average this year of around 205, which is similar to where we are right now. But you can see the seasonal index in here. The fall feeder cattle futures are out there into the mid-230s. I could see us exceeding that, particularly if you look at the deferred live cattle futures for next April. If it goes to 185, we could certainly see feeder cattle prices in the 240s this fall. That's making some money, particularly on some of these cattle that have been bought and carried fairly economically through here. This is what I want to show you, how these prices can change so significantly just on cost to gain alone. We're a little more bearish on cost to gains, if you will, and we feel like they're going to be a little bit more economical. But all last fall and early this spring, we were buying cattle basing on a 130 cost to gain. And look what they averaged, around 180. That's what they did. Now pretty soon we're going to start buying cattle with a cheaper cost to gain against a higher deferred live cattle futures market. And you can see how explosive and the potential that these feeder cattle prices have going forward. We just need to be able to participate in that. Obviously on the calf side, this is what many of you will be interested in this room. We feel like the calves can average somewhere around 245 for the year. I think the thing that is most indicative to me when I look at this is calf prices probably aren't going to fall that much all the way through the year, even as we get into the heart of the fall run during that October time frame when you typically see your lows. Just think about this. If we're going to have feeder cattle that are in the 230s range, we're certainly not going to have calves that are cheaper than feeder cattle. We could actually have calves out there this fall averaging in the 250s on a 5.5 weight steer. I think these summer video sales are going to be extremely important to continue to watch, but the bottom line is out there this fall, we're very favorable for calf prices. I just want to show this because I think this is important to understand that for years we've been somewhat conditioned when we look at the feeder fed spread, say, well, that's been about $30. And we look at the calf fed spread, and that's been about $50 per hundredweight. When we start pushing into these higher prices, these spreads will get significantly wider. So don't discount the fact that at some point during this up price in these cycles that your calves can be selling for $100 a hundredweight or more over the price of fed cattle. And your feeder cattle can be $60, $70, $80 per hundredweight over the price of fed cattle. When you start looking at this on a percentage basis, it makes sense. But don't just get conditioned to say, well, you know, my feeder cattle are always kind of worth $30 over the fed market. We're going into a different time frame, folks. This is going to be exciting for you going forward. Obviously, the utility cows, or the cull cows, if you will, they're going to be high too. When you're going to kill 750,000 fewer of them going forward, that's obviously going to be indicative of a higher price. And I think most people are of the mindset that they don't want to sell many cows going forward, but there's always some culls at the end of the year after we wean some of these calves. This is important, though, when we look at the average producers that are in the gold bars, and we look at the high return producers versus low return producers. And again, this is why I'm challenging each and every one of you to continue to focus on quality. We have to do what's right for an environment. We're not trying to maximize necessarily performance. We're trying to maximize profit. And we do that with quality. And I mean, you look at that 1980 to 1998 time frame when beef demand was cut in half. You look at those low return producers, they never made money. The average return producers were simply in a break even for 2 decades, quite frankly. But look at the high return producers that focus on animal health, nutrition, and genetics. Even in the tough times, they very rarely lost money. This is important. It's really important going forward, because when this cycle turns, and it will, inevitably, at some point we will expand to the point where prices will come down. The high return producers very rarely lose money. I think going forward, this is going to be important. When you look at the correlation between fed cattle prices and bred cow prices, kind of a rule of thumb that I use is whatever pairs are selling for in the spring time frame, in an uptrending market, that's typically what your bred prices are going to be in the fall. Okay? But the correlation between fed cattle values and females or bred cows, we can certainly see that out there as we get out there into the fall time frame, that these bred prices could be $2,400, $2,500 per head, maybe more. I think you got to be careful with this. Remember last time we went through this in 2014, there were a lot of females who were out there bringing $3,000+ per head on the bred side, and they never got a chance to pay for themselves. Some of them are probably still around trying to pay for themselves. Don't get overextended in terms of what you're willing to pay just because you have green grass. You have to go about this smart, and we also have to be very methodical in terms of what we're willing to pay. Don't get to, $3,000 female today's values may not be too high, but they were during the last cycle. So be careful about that going forward. We look at the industry profitability. We're going to see a leverage shift. You see the gold bars on 2016 when the packers started to get leverage. This is going to come much more back in line where this money is more evenly distributed amongst segments. Cow-calf producers are going to be in the driver's seat. They're anticipated to be the most profitable going forward over the next several years. This is really important that we're going to get, there's still enough money in the system, and that's what we want to see, is money in the system. The slack is out of the rope a little bit because the additional money that we're getting now is from the retail side, but that slack is a little bit out of the rope. Now it's going to be somewhat of a battle for market share. But the cow-calf and stocker operators are going to remain in the driver's seat. Long-term outlook at prices. Don't necessarily look at the levels, look at the trends of each of these segments going forward. This cycle is going to be one of the most exciting cycles that we've ever gone through in history, and we're expecting to see the highest prices that we've seen in history. We already have on the fed cattle side. Feel like that if we get any relief at all with regard to Mother Nature and feed costs, that calves and feeder cattle will follow along with the highest prices in history. What questions do we have, Andy?
So, Troy, one of the questions that I was thinking about your statement about quality. How important is it for cow-calf producers to select their bulls based on EPDs, which goes to the theme of our conference? It's all about the numbers.
It's a good question, and Andy's question, if, for those of you that didn't hear it, is how important is it for producers to select their bulls based on EPDs and performance and to continue to focus on quality, if I'm kind of portraying the question correctly. As I mentioned, good cattle will always sell even in a downtrending market, and we know it's inevitably going to happen, and it goes back to our cow-calf survey data, and maybe some of you in this room participated in our cow-calf survey. And I had a slide in here, and I thought I wasn't going to have enough time to show it, and quite frankly, we're a little bit past bull buying season anyway. But our data shows, Andy, and it doesn't always necessarily mean that a higher priced bull means that he's good, but the data does show that higher priced bulls, that the more they pay for their bulls, the higher they sell their calves for. And even in a downtrending market, that's always going to be the case. Focusing on quality, particularly in a downtrending market that we're going to go through, and I feel bad about talking about that, a downtrending market, because we've got several years in front of us of an uptrending market, so don't get me wrong. But inevitably, if you're going to start retaining heifers or buying bred cows, and they're going to be in your herd for 10 years, you're going to see a down cycle during their lifetime. continuing to focus on the consumer and the quality and the performance and your environment and all those things that are important to everyone is going to prove to be what keeps you in business in the long term. It really is.
All right, who else has a question? I'll bring you the mic. It's not every day you get a chance to talk to a 20-year analyst in the cattle markets and all that. Who else has got a question? There's one, all right.
Yes, sir.
And Troy, if you will, share, a lot of people ask me, how do you talked about price of bulls. As the market fluctuates, do you have a rule of thumb of the value of bull relative to calves?
Yeah, that's a good question, Donald, one that I'm sure you've battled with over the years. You know, what is a bull worth? Well, a bull is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, obviously. But I think the seed stock production, the seed stock producers such as yourself are focusing on so many different things and designing bulls for producers in terms of what they need. They want more carcass, they want more growth, they want more calving ease, whatever the case may be. And producers like you, Donald, are ahead of the curve in terms of doing that. So you got to buy what works for you. And obviously, with the age of producers, calving ease has been a big focus. And quite frankly, I think it's taken away some of the performance. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Kelly Giles, Canyon. Coming out of COVID, when we backed all those cattle up, we put more days on these fed cattle, 30 days, 60 days, sometimes 90 days extra on those cattle. But it was a funny thing, and I'm asking for either your confirmation or your insight to this. But when we looked at a linear curve, as those days on feed went up, obviously one of the effects was higher marbling. So we moved select into choice, choice into high choice into prime, et cetera, and so on. So when you put that demand curve right next to it, as the marbling went up on the cattle, so did the demand for that specific product. As you said, prime is the old choice now. And then the price went up accordingly on the choice select spread, the prime spread. So as we walk through that, and if you think about those three curves next to each other, marbling goes up, demand for the product goes up, price goes up. Now thinking through that in reverse, as you decrease marbling in cattle, you are going to decrease the demand, the eating experience. I mean, there's break points in it, obviously, but then you're also going to decrease the price spread. So marbling, tenderness, eating experience is huge, especially in today's the world of disposable income that's just incredible still. So with that said, how would you respond to that or pick that apart? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's an interesting observation, and I don't disagree with you at all in terms of what you're seeing there. But, you know, when it comes down to demand. I mean, that's the thing that it probably spooks me more than anything, that the market may not reach its full price potential. But when we look at the market today, where we're producing a lower percentage of prime cattle, a lot of it due to the weather in the north that we've seen, but we've got a smaller body count as well, just fewer numbers in general. As long as the economy continues to perform, demand for the product is still there, but obviously we're going to see demand differences going forward, particularly due to the global economy, the domestic economy, all of those types of things. But the bottom line is that the globe has gotten a taste for U.S. grain-fed beef. Nobody can produce it in quantity and mass and quality as the United States. And so it's not simply about domestic demand. It continues to be more and more about global demand as we look at the developing countries around the world that want to eat a higher quality protein. The demand for U.S. beef continues to grow. Does that answer your question?
All right, who else has a question? Got time for one more question, and then we're gonna take a quick break. All right, coming your way. If you'll tell us who you are and where you're from, please, sir.
I'm Briley Beck from La Mesa, Texas, here with Texas Tech University. Everywhere I see, whether on social media or on just typical commercials lately, I've been seeing a bigger push for directly marketed to the consumer beef. And I was wondering what your thoughts on that and how that's going to affect our domestic market.
Yeah, it's an interesting question in terms of how does that affect our domestic market. I think just overall, quite frankly, to answer your question, is we're getting the shackle space more in line with the available supply, where the leverage component of the market is more even going forward. But, you know, those are niche markets. I think everybody that can go forward and market their product, a branded product of their own, whether that be locally or regionally, whatever the case may be, I think that is going to be, continue to be a growing and better thing for them. And, you know, if they're buying it somewhere else, there's getting it shorted someplace else at the retail side, and I think that's going to continue to be something that we see more of, quite frankly. People want to know where their food comes from, and so I think that's a growing niche market, if you will. Folks, I've enjoyed the opportunity to be with here immensely. As always, if you have questions or need anything from CattleFax, we'd love to service you. It's been my pleasure to be with you today. Thank you for your attentiveness. I appreciate it.
Before you leave, tell them how they can become a CattleFax member. I'm a CattleFax member.
Yeah, if you'd like to become a member of CattleFax, obviously CattleFax.com. Feel free to call the office. Email me, Troy, at CattleFax.com. We will get you fixed up, and we have different levels of membership. We service any and all types of producers, any size. We'd love to have you as members. So thank you very much once again.